For instance, one thing that suddenly comes back, I was in his office one day, and there were 3 books on the corner of his desk, and he said, "I think you would enjoy those." And they were Lord of the Rings. That kind of meeting of minds. But what I got from Ernest Reed was an attitude to what was happening at that time to us all. And what was happening was the 60s, which is, we realize now, is a kind of a BC AD time in the 20th century. And you know as well as I do that we're still wondering, we're still unraveling the 60s and all the consequences of that. But certainly among clergy at that time, in the mid-20th century, there was either an attitude of, oh my God, what's happening? And various things around that, like, I'm out of here. Somebody once said at that time that it seemed as if the script of the priest had been written out of the great play of Western society. Or you said, God, this is exciting. I don't know what's exciting, but something is exciting. And Ernest Reed fed us that kind of message, that something wonderful, maybe terrifying, is happening. It's going to happen to the church, it's going to happen to the culture, etc. But let's go. As I've often used to say to clergy, in a time like the 60s, you could only be one of 2 things. You could either be a mourner or a midwife. You know, mourners weep for the past, midwives make it possible for the future to be born. And Ernest Reed, I realize now, he died much too young, was a midwife. And he gave us a role model for that, and I will be eternally grateful to him.
And speaking of men who wore the amethyst ring, when you came to Vancouver, Godfrey Gao was bishop, and for most of your time as Dean of New Westminster, David Somerville was bishop, and through many of those years, Ted Scott was primate. I know you were close to all 3. What are your memories of those men?
Well, of the 3, I guess I was least close to, it's funny, even now I hesitate to say Godfrey Gao. My instinct is to say Bishop Godfrey Gao, because Godfrey was like that. He was really a kind of the last of generations of what I would sort of call imperial bishops. And that doesn't mean that he was cold or any of that negative stuff, but I think he was private. He was, you didn't get close to Godfrey. And of course, by the time I met him, he was almost moving away. Because you see, David's coming on the scene was just within a few years of my coming. So one respected Godfrey. There he was as your bishop. You said yes sir, no sir. As a matter of fact, it was Godfrey who lifted the phone when I was in Ottawa and said, Herbert, this is Godfrey Gao. I'm Bishop of New Westminster. I would like you to come and be our dean, and the wardens of the cathedral would be ready to welcome you as rector of the cathedral. David, you know, other things happen in my mind when I say that and I picture him. Wonderful guy. One of these people who carried a brilliant mind very lightly. Could be whimsical, had a really wonderful sense of humor, was deeply, quietly a spiritual human being. You know, there's a phrase somewhere in the Gospels, can't pin it down, where it says of Jesus that he knew what was in man. David knew what was in man. I remember him saying to me one day after a synod meeting, and we were walking away, and he said, "You know, Herbie, there are people in this synod who want me to give directives so that they can say, who the hell does he think he is?" He really was great. Dear friend, and we stayed friends until the end of his life. Felt on a wavelength with him, the natural way he took liturgy, the calm way that he handled troublesome stuff, the compassionate way that he handled clergy, for that matter, anybody's problems. Calm, compassion, discerning, all of those things David Somerville was.
It was a time of some ferment in the church. There was the very conservative movement. At the same time, there was an almost divisive Pentecostal revival, and it seemed that David had to deal with both of those.
Yes, and he never sort of panicked under that. He, I don't know whether I never saw any sign that they distressed him. They interested in him. They interested him. They intrigued him. But he was big enough to, again, okay, we're now 70s, which are still turbulent, are still, a world is being changed, a church is being changed. And David was big enough to see those movements as part of a larger process. Ted Scott, I really always remember Ted as one of the most unassuming people you could imagine. I remember inviting him to Washington, to the cathedral, and going down to the airport to welcome him. And he comes off the plane, baggy pants, sweater, cardigan, just cardigan, purple shirt and cross, but the cardigan and the pants, said, "I am very easy in my skin. I am sort of as much as you could be at that sort of turbulent time. I am at peace with myself." But as regards the church, the institution, I think Ted was deeply spiritual, but I think he had a kind of a love-hate relationship with the church, the organization, with the stuff. You know, the meetings, the stuff. That wasn't, as we used to say, that wasn't his bag. But integrity, humility, decency, compassion, he is right up there for me, Ted Scott.
There's a story, I'm not sure whether you told me this or Archbishop Somerville told me this, of the two of you walking in the procession one morning at the cathedral.
I was just thinking of this.
Yes.
Well, at least I think it's this. Yes. Tell me.
And one of you said to the other, which one of us is giving the sermon this morning?
Yeah, I that blew somebody's mind who overheard it. Excuse me, it's blowing my mind now. And I'm really wondering whether I would have been that risk-taking. But I do know that that happened. It's not apocryphal. It must be true.
Of course. There was another moment, there was a synod at which, rather cunningly, rather amusingly, I thought, David Somerville had you and Harry Robinson of St. John Shaughnessy doing morning and afternoon reflections. It was like dueling homilies.
Now, I had forgotten that. But I could see at that time how that would have been extraordinary. Let's just put it like that. Because we would have been at the opposite ends of the spectrum of those days. You know, talking about the excitement of what I've sort of given the overall name to the 60s. When the first days that we came to Vancouver, we stayed in the Sylvia Hotel. 4 kids, one of them 5 months, the other 10. And Paula held, I think it was about my 3rd evening in Vancouver. It was September. Weather happened to be good. And Paula held the fort for a couple of hours. It was after supper. And I went out for a walk. Denman. What's the uphill street that intersects with Denman? Anyway, that whole area of the Sylvia Hotel, English Beach, etc. And we had come from Ottawa, which was different in atmosphere, more formal city, etc. And there was something about what was happening around me. Shops with posters I'd never seen, lifestyles, aliveness. And I can remember the thrill of that and the wanting to be part of it and the wanting to get at it in the cathedral. It was a good feeling.
Yes, that led perhaps to some of the liturgical and musical experimentation that took place. We can remember the David Louis, Richard Izunian production of Godspell, Norman's Maranatha. We remember the Mitchells, Ron and Muriel, the Ian and Sylvia of the cathedral, 24 teenagers with guitars, all of which, the embracing of the arts community and the reaching out to a younger group, which led to perhaps what the cathedral is today.
Well, I tell you what, I really had help in that. And a person who had a real gift for making those connections was Bob Pinn. Bob had come, he and Helen had come from Cambridge and Boston. They were really city folk, and he was totally at home at the corner of George and Burrard. And it was he who made most of those connections. So he made those connections, and all sorts of good things happened. And a couple of years went by, and then he said to me one day at a staff meeting, he said, you know, we've had these what do they call them, folk masses. And he said, they're great, but he said, I think the time has come to have a rock mass. Oh, my blood went cold. My first reaction, I said, Bob, I will support you, but that's yours. And so we had that first rock mass. And the place, do you know, I went downstairs, it got so wild, in a good sense, because we had a great ensemble. We had was his name? Bruce Fairbairn?
Yes.
Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
His dad, things are coming back. His dad was head of the Y. Excuse me. And Bruce and his guys provided wonderful music. I mean, looking back now, it was comparatively tame. But it was new, it was exciting. Cathedral, people were hanging from the rafters. When we shared the sacrament, my goodness, you never knew what kind of human being was going to come up or how he or she was going to behave. And it was all thrillingly alive. The only but to it is, when the beat started and people began to sort of register, because I don't want to get heavy duty about this, but I remember reading once how when you see people praying, when you see Orthodox and Jewish people praying at the Wailing Wall, you notice how they pray. They pray very physically. And looking back now, I realize how this was happening then. It was part of the sort of excitement of the time. And so there was tremendous sort of physical movement. And because it was in sort of rhythm of a whole crowd, I went downstairs and I looked up and I would swear that the roof of the hall or the floor of the cathedral, whichever you like to look at it, was moving slightly. And I had a momentary vision of something really awful happening. But it passed, and it was wonderful. But that was Bob's contribution. Really fortunate all the way through my ministry in those. I think there's a kind of a secret about finding staff that I've really pushed at a lot of people. Very often, you know, somebody's in a large parish and he, or nowadays she says, I need to get help. And they make a mistake. They look around for somebody like themselves. And I began to realize that what you did was you said, who has what I don't have? And it really paid off. It really paid off. Like Jim McCullum, bless his heart. Jim McCullum, wonderful, warm guy pastorally, but a wonderfully rich mixture of warm pastoral and absolutely detailed administration skills. He would think of something before I'd even thought of it. He would say, you know, I think it's time to do X. Or, if we're going to do Y, we need that, and that. And he always had his sort of pad and a sheet, etc. Jim McCullum was wonderful. I remember when Doug Hambidge was elected bishop, and I came in a decent second. You know what happened after that election? It was in St. Catherine's, and I was due to get on a plane the next day to go to Geneva to pick up a group of pilgrims. And I was walking out, and David had been up in the gallery. And he and I happened to coincide. He came down the stairs, and I was walking out. And he put his hands on both my shoulders and said, Herbie, today you have been set free. And he was so right. But I remember thinking and saying to myself, if I am elected in this thing. And I was very mixed inside myself.
You were reluctant, I believe.
The what?
You were reluctant to allow your name to stand.
Oh yeah, I slid in I slid into bass at the last second. Michael Carabellas sort of harumphed a bit about late filings. Only I felt if I didn't put in my name as the dean, I was sort of making a comment or something. Anyway, I didn't. And I can truly say that I'm deeply grateful because the church, in its wisdom, let's use that kind of language, could see that that wasn't Herbert O'Driscoll. But I was saying to myself, though, just to finish this, I was saying to myself as I sat there and said, you know, let's see what's going to happen. If I get this, I'm going to make 2 phone calls. One will be to Jim McCullum, and I will say, Jim, I need an administrator of this diocese. And the second was to Jim Cruikshank. I was going to say, Jim, I need a program director. So that's a piece of alternate history that never happened.
When the votes were tallied, the delegates gave you a standing ovation, and Jim had to turn to you and say, Herbie, this is for you.
You know, I'd forgotten all that. I guess I was in a kind of a miasma. I had forgotten all of that. Yeah. You know, talking about Jim, and yours truly, and Michael Ingham, and Northcote Burke, thought struck me why the cathedral today is the really alive place that it is. I have a gut feeling it's because if you look at those 5 guys, those 5 faces, and Northcote tends to be back there, he gets forgotten, but he shouldn't be forgotten because do you know Northcote Burke, when he was in Ottawa, in St. John's, during and just after the war, was the person who brought to Canada the concept of an alternate service at 9:15. And he picked it up from Ernie Southcote, who was, I mean, this is back 1940s. Ernie Southcote, in the Diocese of London, began what was called the Parish and People movement, where he was sort of saying, worship has to be different. There have got to be possibilities for worship. One kind of worship is not everybody's bag. And Northcote picked that up. And in those days, he was kind of lonely on that. And I think ran into flack. But then he came from St. John's in Ottawa to, well, he first went to Toronto, and then he came to Vancouver. And he began that 9:15 in the cathedral and began to work at loosening things, getting them to relax, getting them to be ready to adventure a bit. It's still very conservative city, very, you know, late 50s. Not the Vancouver of today by any means. Then what you had was, you had a succession of us, and none of the 5 of us ever changed course. Northcote, bless his heart, died on the job. Almost literally died on the job. I came, did my thing for 14 years, and I thank God for, you know, when I say I came, suddenly I see all sorts of faces and voices and wonderful people who made it all possible. But there was then Jim Cruikshank, and then Michael Ingham, and then Peter. And all of us, nobody tried to turn the ship around. You know how that ghastly thing can sometimes happen in a parish? You know, A does his or her job, B comes in and says, oh, you know, that's not the way. And you lose traction for years. In the cathedral, the ship has been able to sail steadily through time and keep its voyage rich and creative and exciting and more deeply spiritual as time goes on. I think that is the great blessing that the cathedral has been given, and that has enabled many lay people to have a very long, wonderful ministry themselves in the cathedral, because they didn't have to respond to some great, as it were, interruption as the five of us came and went.